Live streaming is on.
Hello, everybody. It's Friday, 5 p.m. in Spain, 11 a.m. in the East Coast, 8 a.m. in the West Coast, or nothing at all if you watch this not live. So doesn't matter. We are here with Mr. Paul Levitz. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing fine this morning. Thank you, sir.
How's things in New York? Is it getting better? As crazy as it was some weeks ago, as it was here, let's be honest.
So my apartment is in Greenwich Village, overlooking Broadway. And for about a week solid, I had protest marches literally going under my window. I had lots of the neighborhood boarded up, 3 blocks from my building. I walked out one morning to 2 burned out police cars from the protests. It's calmed down now. I mean, I think what we're seeing in much of the US is we're seeing a lot of the local governments, the state governments, the city governments taking actions that they should have taken years ago to adjust the standards of what police behavior is, adjust the standards that police are going to be held to. In New York State, the governor and the legislature passed about 10 bills in the past week, all dealing with aspects of that, reducing the kind of immunity that police officers have. And, you know, it's obviously the vast majority of the police officers are just people trying to do their job decently. But there are some terrible people in it, and there are a lot of people who get caught up in the situations. I listened to a presentation by a professor who consults with police forces nationally about how to reduce violence against civilians. And he said the most effective technique that they had come up with was dealt with police foot chases. Because when you've got a cop chasing someone who's running away from a crime scene, whether they're guilty or they're not guilty or they're just scared, you know, the majority of the cops are not in perfect shape. And you run a couple of blocks steady, and even if you are in perfect shape, your adrenaline's going. If you're not in perfect shape, it's your adrenaline and your heart's pounding and everything's going. And they would chase somebody for a couple of blocks, catch up with them. They'd be so overworked, that's when they beat the shit out of the guy. And just by changing the rules of pursuit, the cops weren't allowed to foot chase past a certain distance. They reduced the amount of police on civilian violence by over 30% in the cities where they instituted this.
Wow.
So, you know, sometimes it's just a matter of analyzing the thing, putting some logic in place. I don't mean to say racism doesn't play a part in it. It obviously does. But it's a combination of racism, some bad people, some just stupid people, and guidelines, setups, and rules that don't work right. Bring in body cameras, you dramatically reduce the amount of violence. I got friendly with the gal who used to be the chief of police in San Diego. She'd show up at the convention. She was a friend through my family. Her brother was a buddy of mine for many years. And she'd show up and say, look, somebody can start something here. There's no way that I can protect a place with this many people and guarantee that no one can get in and start something. But they ain't gonna do much. And she'd start pointing out where she had snipers hidden around the convention and where she had the cops patrolling. She was such an advocate when she was the chief of police there for about 5-6 years for body cameras, because she said, look, we don't want the bad cops either. And this way we'll be able to identify them. We'll be able to deal with the situations. A lot of good people doing police work, some bad people. And we have a country that has a long, really difficult history that we have to work our way past. And you don't get over hundreds of years of bad behavior by writing an apology note, and you don't get over it in one generation.
Yeah, I always tell the same anecdote. There was a certain project that you approved years ago that it was called, I don't even know if you remember it, Batman in Barcelona, Dragon's Night. It was you, me, and John Cunningham in San Diego discussing it.
Yeah.
And then if you remember, Mark Waid wrote the project, and I was just advising in terms of, you're talking about Barcelona,
Right.
there are things that you don't know how they work. And there was a scene where literally the cops see Killer Croc near Sagrada Familia, and the first thing they do as soon as they see him is pull up the guns and start shooting. And I was like, Mark, you can do that. Like, why? Because you can't do that here. Like, not even a monster. No, you just can't. If a cop pulls up the gun before he shot or threatened, blah blah blah, and the monster, they can prove they've been threatened, they go to jail.
Huh.
You just can't do it. It's only if they can demonstrate they've been threatened, or or they're at risk of losing their life. And he was like, whoa, I would never have thought that, because that's why I'm advising you. If you write that for a scene happening in Barcelona, everybody reading it here is going to say, this guy has no clue. So I always tell the same anecdote about how he had to rewire.
Yeah.
Thinking.
And hopefully we'll mature our culture. You guys have a few hundred years on us.
That's also true.
You have an advantage there. You've had a little more time to get this act right.
And a few dictators too. So we're ahead on that too.
Yeah, we seem to have been working on trying to catch up on that, but I'm hoping we won't learn.
I hope that doesn't happen. Hey, what is the thing? If there's anything that you really miss, with this pandemic, and I always tell the same joke. The second day I did this, Howard Chaykin gave me the perfect definition, which was the most boring apocalypse in the history of apocalypses. Because God, you expect red clouds, dripping with blood, zombies on the street. You look out your window that you just have behind you, and you're like, oh my God. But this is like boring. You just, hey, what do? You get out. Oh, you die. Okay, that's it. So is there anything you really miss out of this, going to a deli or anything like that?
Well, I miss seeing my grandson who's in Chicago, who's 2 years old. I was going there about once a month, watching him grow, and FaceTime isn't quite the same. I miss veal parmesan sandwiches because there's no good place right around here that delivers a good one. And I miss great Chinese food because I live about a mile or so from Chinatown, and it's also right near one of the schools I teach at, Pace University.
Mm-hmm.
I'd have lunch there about twice a week during the school year, usually. And it has the usual takeout and delivery Chinese places aren't nearly of the same standard. It's you miss real life. I miss having lunch with people. Mm-hmm. I miss the conversations. Zoom is a lovely technology, and it would have been amazing to have in most of my career. I would have loved being able to collaborate with artists, holding up the sketch of
yes, absolutely,
in the middle of doing. But it's not the same thing as sitting across a table and sipping your soda and throwing sentences back and forth and laughing.
Yeah, this is the same
everywhere.
I'm getting two things out of this, on all these conversations. One of them is that people is overworking like crazy, and not even intentionally. You're just home as you usually are because you're an artist or writer, but for whatever reason, your brain is overpumping. So you're just working and working. I don't know if it's your case. And the second, that most people, what they miss is not even the conventions it's just sitting down with people after or at night or during the show and just sit down and talk to friends that sometimes you don't see in 6 months or a year. Mm-hmm. Just talking to people that you're going to find there.
We have a really interesting and tight community in comics over the years. It's a lot of wonderful and odd people, the friends you make. Not just the writers and artists, but like I was talking about the police chief a minute ago.
Yep.
We connect to all of these different people, these different lives, and that's part of the glory of it. And we're still doing some of it. You pick up the phone or you send an email, but it's not the same. I'm not working hard. One project that I was working on got a pencils down, waiting for that to be started up again. Another one that was supposed to be published in June got taken off the schedule for the moment. It's my computer dinging. Don't worry about it.
No way.
Got taken off the schedule for the moment, sensibly. No new release date scheduled for it yet. I guess it'll be sometime in the fall. I've got a couple of things I could work on, but nothing that's urgent.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm rereading the Nero Wolfe novels in sequence, seeing what I can learn from that and what I think about that.
Mm-hmm.
Teaching one summer course and futzing around a little bit.
Mm-hmm. I was remembering because of what you mentioned about Zoom and how good it had been for you, during your career. And I was with Mark. We all said the same thing. Imagine if this had happened, this apocalypse 30 years ago. Not even 30, 20 years ago, when we didn't have Netflix, Prime, Zoom, email and all that. And Howard was telling me also, you got to remember when I started, it's not that I sent by FedEx. It's that I have to go to the public bus station, give the art to the bus driver. The bus driver could take it to John Workman, to my letter, and Workman would receive it in the bus station, work on it, give it back to the driver, and give it back to me. So it's not even the fax thing, because I was telling him when I started there was no email. It was all by fax. There was no fax at my parents' house, so I had to become friends with the local, chaos guy who had a fax machine and stay there until they send the files back and all that.
You try and I started in the business at about the same minute that Howard did. You try and explain to people today what you worked with, and it's kind of, so were there dinosaurs outside at that time, or were you up to the woolly mammoths, Grandpa? Dan Greenfield, who does the 13th Dimension website, is doing a retro hot picks feature at the moment. And he said, all right, so would you like to do This Week in 1973? Sort of like doing, here in America, we had a guy named Casey Kasem who did the top 40. I don't know if it got syndicated.
Yeah, it got syndicated in Spain. I remember as a kid hearing Casey Kasem's American Top 40. Yeah.
So they still replay that on one of the channels regularly. So you can listen to, these were the top 40 songs of 1973, and you hear Casey Kasem, and you're flashing on Scooby-Doo the whole time because he did one of the voices there. So Dan is doing that kind of approach. He said, so could you do This Week in 1973? And I went and I pulled out my own fanzine, which was the TV guide in 1973, basically, for the field. And I looked through that week in 1973. Boy, this was a great week in 1973. You had the Joker's Five-Way Revenge from Denny and Neil.
Yeah.
You had the first issue where the Legion became the lead feature in Superboy. You had Don McGregor's first issue of The Black Panther and Jungle Action. The first part of Red Nails by Roy and Barry Windsor Smith. And, on and on and on and on. And you look at the list of what was going on. On the other hand, if you look at the fanzine by modern desktop publishing standards, this was either produced by a troll underground using a stone chisel or somebody who was definitely brain dead, because any 5-year-old child can do something more sophisticated with the tools that are available now. Just it's a different world. Mostly wonderful. Not always, but mostly.
Yeah. Why comics? Why, when you were growing up, what made you go to comics? As a professional, not as a fan, because as a fan, we grow up reading them, I guess, as
Yeah.
reading something else. But as a professional, why? Why not movies? Why not literature? Why comics?
Well, I read all the books I could. So prose certainly was a major part of my life. When I went back to my elementary school, New York does a stunt called Principal for a Day that sends business people in to work with the principals in the schools occasionally.
Mhm.
So I went back to my elementary school 50 odd years later, and I knew how to find my way to the library in the school. That was the room I remembered most vividly. And I
Mhm.
could point to the shelves where the science fiction books had been, and the Mary Poppins and Dr. Dolittle books that I had loved as a kid. I loved to read. So I
Mhm.
read everything. I read books, I read comics. TV was pretty hideous in those years. There wasn't a lot that was imaginative. I was already 10 or 10 or so years old by the time you get to Star Trek on television, and that was, even then, that was on too late in the evening
Mhm.
for me to watch as a 10-year-old child.
It was the original, or it was the reruns already?
The original. So there wasn't a lot in TV for me to fall in love with, perhaps.
Mhm.
Whatever reason, I didn't get to go to the movies very often. I wasn't the healthiest of kids, so I was home a lot. So the comics were there, and you could read them, you could reread them, you could make your own little pseudo action figures out of paper dolls, make environments. It was a world to disappear into, I guess.
Mhm.
And I had the good luck to be growing up in New York. Basically, all the kids in my generation who really loved comics in New York got a chance to be in the industry. It was a moment in time when the first generation, the older guys, were aging out, either getting other kinds of jobs or giving up entirely. So we all got a shot at doing something. Some people tried it for 2 minutes and ran, said this is nuts. Some people didn't have any particular talent that was useful for the business. Um, some others didn't work out because the relationships didn't work out with their bosses or whatever. I was doing it to pay my way through school, and I figured I'd get a real job. It just didn't quite work out that way.
Mhm. Why is New York um, and publishing so connected? I mean, every I told you this, and I told everybody, even if they don't like it, and I still think moving DC to the West Coast was nuts. It's like severing a limb out of the company. I'm not asking you about that. Don't worry about that. But I'm saying, why is New York and comics and newspapers and press in general, as publishing in general, and why are they so connected? Because for me, same in Spain, if you talk about publishing, mostly Barcelona, not Madrid, So if you take things out of Barcelona, it's just weird. New York for me is that. It's like the center of publishing. Why is it so connected?
Well, through most of modern history, before technology erupted in the last 25 years, you tended to have concentrations, whether it was because the educational system turned out people specifically for that. There are three or so programs where you can get a graduate degree in publishing in New York. There aren't any in most of the country. You had people move from one company to another. So if you wanted to start a publishing company and you want to be able to hire people, it was easier to hire them in New York.
Mm-hmm.
At one point, some years ago, I got a call from a recruiter. They were looking for a new head of Sheed McNeil Andrews, the publishing company that also does a lot of newspaper comics work. And They had a long list of qualifications that they were interested in. I wasn't looking for a job, but I fit the qualifications. They were calling. No, thank you. I'm happy with what I'm doing. They said, well, can you recommend somebody? I said, well, I don't know anybody who wants to, in publishing, who has that range of qualifications, who wants to go to Kansas City. I'm sure Kansas City is a wonderful place to live. You can afford a better house, I'm sure, than you can in the New York metro area. The air is clearer. Sure, the people are nice. The couple of people I know in Kansas City have been very nice people. But people don't wake up in the morning and say, I want to move to Kansas City. Now, I don't know that this is going to continue to be true as technology, as we were talking a minute ago, allows you to run your business more remotely than it was before. But for much of the last 100 years, in the US, there have been really 3 aspirational cities. You wanted to move to New York if you wanted to be in the media. You wanted to move to Hollywood, was never even described as Los Angeles, if you wanted to be in the movies and TV. You want to move to Washington if you want to be in government. That began to change with Silicon Valley.
Of course, yeah.
Okay, I want to move to San Francisco or the Bay Area if I want to be in tech. And there were other wonderful cities, but Boston's a fabulous city. People love living there. Chicago's a great city. I have my daughter and her family there. But if you poll the majority of Americans, if they didn't want to live where they grew up, and most people did, these were the cities that had the magic lure. I don't know if that's going to be true in another 5 or 10 years. If we can all work from home, and that becomes the norm, there are going to be a lot of empty skyscrapers in New York, and the culture will change a lot. But it also goes back to what you were talking about with the conventions. You were in publishing, and it got to a certain hour of the evening, and here was the bar that everybody went to.
Absolutely, yeah.
You got the gossip. You heard what somebody else was doing. You got to schmooze. If you were an editor, you got to schmooze with the agent who was selling something and build a relationship. So maybe they would bring it to you the next time. We build on human connections.
Yeah.
It really doesn't matter what industry you're in. There's some level where you rely on your friends. You rely on the people whose judgment you trust, and that builds up over a period of time. I learned as much about comics playing poker as I learned in any other setting, because the poker game I sat in on for 5 years of my relative youth in the field, Len Wein, Marv Wolfman, Denny O'Neil, Jim Shooter, Al Milgram, once in a while Chris Claremont, once in a while Frank Miller, Roger McKenzie, Roger Slifer, Jack Abel, the token old guy in it, Marty Pasco, Steve Mitchell, Tom DeFalco. We all learned together. We sat around, we looked at the pages that each other were working on. We bitched and moaned about the same problem with a collaborator we were working with, or why can't the business do this other thing that we've been dreaming of for years? Why can't we make more money doing this? Why can't we have the printing be better? Look at those beautiful European albums. How come we can't do something like that? And we didn't solve all the problems, but you build consensus, you build relationships, you build knowledge. Zoom's not nearly as good for that.
Yeah, absolutely not.
Maybe it will be for our kids' generation. Maybe they'll grow up so wired that it becomes their corner bar and they'll bring their own whiskey. But I'm sticking with my lemonade.
Yeah. I don't see it. I don't see it. There's something, I still miss, when I could go to New York, and I started going 21 years ago, 22 years ago, I don't know, regularly. I mean, and I could just go walk because I walked from Marble to DC to Valiant or something like that, and meet everybody in the middle, like, let's go to this bar, this other bar, this restaurant, and you met everybody. And there was, in my case, there was no limitation. You're Marble, you're DC. Well, I don't give a shit. Let's just sit down together and we all talk, we all gossip, we all learn things.
Yeah.
You cannot substitute that with Zoom. You just can't. That's going to still happen, even if the new generation starts, with the connection and the digital frame. As soon as you sit down and see how things work in that sense, you're going to say, oh, this is better.
I don't know. I mean, their world may be a different world. I'll give them the possibility that it'll be just as magical in some totally different way that I can't figure out.
Absolutely. And also, the pandemic can, force us to change things in a way that it's happening in Spain, for example. We have areas that are called the abandoned areas, like rural areas.
Yeah.
They are not abandoned, but it's rural areas where people has moved out to the big city.
Yes,
and have a small population.
There's just nobody much living in it. There's two farms left and a lot of empty space.
Exactly. But a lot of it's now with the pandemic is happening the other way around. A lot of people is leaving the cities to go live there because it feels safe. There's more distance. They're in nature, etc., etc. And there's also a big government program, literally, that is to get really good internet, rural internet, you want to call it, really good connections for that area. So maybe that what you just mentioned about Kansas City, somebody who maybe 3 months ago would say, no, you know what, I'd rather stay in New York, would now say, maybe Kansas City is not the best example because it's a big city, but whatever other town.
But Kansas, period.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, you can move here, and you are like, oh, this is going to be safer than New York. Maybe my family should move there because of the pandemic, and then we'll see in 2 or 3 years. Because even more, you Americans have something that we don't have, not even close here in Europe, especially in Spain, which is you guys move around the country a lot more.
Yeah.
We don't. It's not even for college. You go to college if you can near home. You don't go to the other side of the country.
Well,
so we'll go, please.
More time to put roots down.
Mm-hmm.
Virtually any American family, if you go back to the grandparents, they came from thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
Other countries, other languages. I'm first generation American. My mother was born in Poland.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember the statistics of what percentage of Americans have a grandparent born overseas, but it's still a massive percentage.
Yeah.
So you don't have the same affiliation that you have where there's grandma's house on the corner.
Yes, absolutely.
Even if grandma had been in America, she was probably in some hovel.
Mm-hmm.
Some ghetto that immigrants are shoved into everywhere. So, Spain has a significant immigrant population.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine that the immigrant population in Spain that's come in probably from North Africa more than anything else.
Mostly, yeah. So,
they don't have the same level of roots to a particular city or a particular town yet.
Yeah.
And they probably move, maybe not at the same speed as Americans, but they probably move fairly regularly. Whereas your family, how many generations can you track your family back in Barcelona?
No, I'm known in Barcelona because I am not from Barcelona. I am one of the ones who have no problems moving. Maybe because of your influence, you guys. No, I am from Galicia.
Too many comic books.
Yeah, exactly. I am from the other side of the country. In my case, my affiliation was easy. Was to choose between my land and my wife.
Yeah, that'll do it.
But she wasn't my wife back then, of course, but it was like, you got to pick.
Right.
She was there for a year. She missed her family too much. Yep. And the choice was staying here with healthcare or moving there. So I was like, you know what? Fuck it. I'm moving.
How many generations has her family been there?
Same thing. Because her family is, we are exceptions, you got to say, because her family is from Madrid. but her dad in architecture, he had to move around a lot, because he was public buildings, he was, so his company moved him around until he got tired, and every one of the five children he or she was born in a different part of the country.
Oh, wow.
So when the fourth came in, they were like, where are we now? Sabadell, which is in Barcelona. Like, here. No, we are not moving more. So he told the company, look, you're making me move with my five to come everywhere around. So I'm stopping. No, but for family, like 5-6 generations, I would say, in Madrid. My family in Galicia, with the exception, so, immigration because of Franco, of course, because of the fascist government, or because of the 50s where there was almost no food in Spain, so you had to move out. Galicia was very poor. It's like one of the poorest parts of the country. So by the end of the 19th century, there was a lot of immigration, as you know, to Argentina, to South America. And then in the 50s, because of the shortages after the Civil War, a lot of Galicians moved to Switzerland or to Germany or to France. So we moved around. My family, I have a lot of family all over the world. In fact, I have family in New Jersey. Believe it or not.
I'm sorry. Give them my
And have family in New Jersey and in Portland. Believe it or not, that for immigration on the 50s. No, just
yeah.
I don't know. We're crazy. So, yeah, my family in Galicia, I could tell you like 5-6 generations at least. So
that you can track.
Yeah. Let me say hello to people and see if there's... Oh, people is asking. Let me see. Hi, Felipe Gonzalez says, hi, Paul. A pleasure to have somebody who helps so much the comic book industry and DC Comics. And he asks, how do you remember your first assignment on DC?
Oh, that's easy. So I'm walking through the halls in December of 72, working on my fanzine, getting news from the different editors. And Joe Orlando shouts out, come in here. I never remembered anybody's name. Even I was working for him for months before he could remember my name on a regular basis. And he says, you want to write my letters pages? I said, Joe, I'm not a writer. He said, I read your fanzine. You write well enough to write a letters page. This is not exactly a very high bar. I think I was the first breathing human being to walk past his office after Marv gave up the assignment. I was 16. I had no qualifications, but shit, this was wonderful. So $15 a letter column, and suddenly I'm a professional writer, and I have an excuse to spend even more time at DC. And I was getting to do, I think, about eight of them a month, and within a month or two, I was also writing DC's equivalent to the bullpen pages, the direct currents pages, Amazing World of DC, things like that, for Saul Harrison down the hall, and slowly sort of wormed my way in.
How old was Marv then?
Well, Marv is 8. Marv's a full decade older than I am, so he would have been about 26. I think that's when he was going over to work at Warren.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's why I was asking. Angel Perez asks, Mr. Levitz, have you read the Brian Michael Bendis Legion of Superheroes comics? Did you like his version of Your Kids?
I read the first one just out of curiosity, and Brian's a really good writer. They're not my kids. They're these guys who look a little bit like my kids, and he's not, and they shouldn't be my kids.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the same reaction I had, in a sense, to going to Birds of Prey, the movie.
Mm-hmm.
It was really nice to see the Huntress up there and to see the sort of Huntress logo splash up there. And it'll be nice to cash a check when that comes in. When I built the character, I built her on top of Bill Finger, on top of Bob Kane, on top of Jerry Robinson, on top of Dick Sprang. When I did the Legion, My Legion was built on Otto Binder and Jerry Siegel and Ed Hamilton and Jim Shooter, even a little bit of Carrie Bates. You know, when you do that the deal is somebody else gets to build on top of you.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think you have any moral right, emotional right to be pissed when that happens. You just kind of have to look and say, yeah, you know, it's your turn. I hope the magic works. I hope you have as much fun doing it as I had. I hope you amuse as many people as I did. But it's your thing. Go have some fun.
Mm-hmm. Let me see. El Turno Nocturno, that's the name, says, when DC bought Wildstorm, you said that it was made in order to get a different flavor for DC. Was one of that flavors Vertigo oriented? I don't know if I understand the question.
I think I do. So
I mean, because he's clarifying. I mean, was DC's move oriented to protect and reinforce Vertigo with Wildstorm Mature Comics line? Do you think that worked?
We definitely didn't look at Wildstorm for the mature readers stuff. When Image launched, they attracted a large audience. Part of it was the moment that they started. There was a lot of speculation. There were giant crates of Image comics that stayed in speculators' basements for the next 100 years, acquiring no value. But there were also a lot of people who just read what Todd and Jim, Valentino, so many of the guys were doing, Eric, and really enjoyed it. And we didn't have any DC editors who liked those books. We didn't have any DC editors who wanted to do books that felt that way. So, I think at least my philosophy as a publisher was I wanted us to offer all the flavors in our ice cream store that people wanted. We didn't necessarily have to have Pistachio Crunch Ripple if that sold, one copy every 73 weeks. But we had great line of vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, but there was no reason we couldn't have sherbet. And whether I liked sherbet or not, whether I thought it had enough substance to it, if there were enough readers who liked sherbet, we should get the guy in the back to make some damn sherbet and put it out there. And I couldn't succeed in having anybody make any sherbet. So we had to go out and buy a sherbet factory. I don't think Wildstorm did fabulously at mature readers stuff. Not that the books weren't always good. Some of them were lovely when they tried it, but they had a harder time figuring out what the boundaries that DC was comfortable with. The Problem with the Boys was an example of that. This Boys was not a bad comic. It was interesting, entertaining. It wasn't really something DC should be publishing because it was making fun of our own characters in a particular fashion. So once that happened, we worked out, the gentlest possible way of sending it somewhere else, and turned around to the creators and said, look, we're sorry. We miscommunicated among ourselves about this. Never mind what the contract says about how long we're entitled to hold on to this or what the rules are. You can take this anywhere you want but Marvel, and we'll do whatever we can to make the transition easy. And I think Nick Barucci owes me a lot more than dinner in the deal.
Yes, he does.
But he's a nice man, and I'm sure he will eventually pay up.
Yeah, we'll do. Let's hope so. Locke Frank Howard asks, what notable changes did you make? Well, this is a big question. What notable changes did you make in DC from the 70s to the 80s?
Well, The changes that I'm proudest of were doing the first written contracts for creators
Mm-hmm.
as a standard system. You know, if you were whoever the superstar of a generation was, you often could get a written contract. But for the first time in 77, we put in a standard written contract that just said, look, this is the deal.
Mm-hmm.
No bullshit. It's enforceable. We have to pay you in this amount of time. We have to return your original art. You know, it's not a very giant leap forward in terms of what the deal was, but it was a civilizing step, going from the old-fashioned back of the check of, you know, after you've done the work, if you want the money, sign here, and you're waiving all of your rights. It was, no, upfront, we're telling you what the rules are. If this is not the right deal for you, great, go somewhere else where you can get a deal that you want. Instituting a couple of years after that royalties, which I think is really the thing that most dramatically changed the business, because it really allowed the writers and artists to bet on themselves in an important way. And then in the mid-'80s, the work we did establishing the trade paperback format as the standard for the graphic novel.
Yeah.
I think those are the most enduring contributions that I was part of. All of them are not things that I did, big letter I. You know, there were always groups of people. Jeanette Kahn, who was the company's president in those years, was a part of it. Each of the different steps had different people involved, whether it was Joe Orlando, Dick Giordano on the creative side, helping us figure out the fair way to divide royalties among multiple creators, or the marketing team, a guy named Bruce Bristow, who was in comics for about a decade, Bob Wayne, was in comics for about forever, one way or another, playing really important roles in the graphic novel format. And of course, the creators who helped establish the graphic novel format. You know, that would not have happened without the work that Frank and Klaus did, the work that Alan and Dave did, and maybe most importantly, the work that Neil did, because it really was Sandman's success as an ongoing series of graphic novels that anchored that space and made bookstores have a real graphic novel section instead of trying to shove us in with Garfield.
Don't you think Vertigo as a whole was really, really a big part of it? I mean, of course, Sandman is the launching pad, to say, in a way, and the anchor to what everything else, you know, hang on to. But Vertigo as a whole was, at least for me, when I started reading it, like, if this is not devised to become graphic novels, all of the books, they are perfect anyway.
You know, Sandman doesn't exist without Karen, without Vertigo, without Jeanette, and the collective courage. I credit Neil in the sentence I just used, because there was a window of opportunity there to do a different kind of creative work. Karen was actively looking for it, was actively supporting it and promoting it. Jeanette wanted the company to expand in all of those ways. Neil came in and did something that used that window of opportunity in a unique way. I don't mean to say there weren't other people who wanted to or who made contributions, but he stuck with it for a long period of time. He built up a real pattern with Sandman that brought in readers and kept readers. He was a very active participant in marketing the material. He was out there constantly. He's a great marketing mind, as well as being a great writer. He was a smart marketer as a young man. You know, he asked the best questions and had a lot of great ideas, some of which were not practical at the time, but we ended up being able to do in years that followed. You can open the door, but it's the creative work that changes the world.
Mhm.
And we can sit there as long as the day is and say, we'd like to do something that will bring young women into reading comics. That's very nice. And certainly Jeanette wanted that, and I wanted that, and Karen wanted that, and Dick wanted that, and eight different people down the hall wanted that. And Neil delivered on it. And I don't know that Neil sat there and said, I want young women to read comics. He just wanted to write a story. And that particular story made sense for that group of people. And that was the first time in a long time that we had somebody who could perform that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me see. Eduardo Sacristan asks, how was writing JSA to close the first run Jeff Jones did? It was something that Jeff asked you to do, or did you offer to do it?
So Dan and Jeff had come down to pitch whichever crisis it was that week. and Dan liked to use easels and flip charts. And he goes through this whole presentation of all the wonderful things they're going to do and this and that. And one of his punchlines is, and then we're going to leap the whole DC universe ahead a year. And nobody's going to know what happened that year. And I say, well, that's nice, but that's been done. And frankly, it hasn't been done really well in the past. So if you're going to do that, I think you have to do something that pays it off more.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, the TV show 24 was fairly new. And I kind of riffed off that and said, so maybe if you're going to leap ahead a year, maybe what you do is you do something like, I don't know, 52. And you tell the story of the missing year in a 52-week book. And you know Dan, you've worked with him a lot. He's very high energy. He's very enthusiastic when he gets going. You see the gleam in his eye.
Yeah.
Says, okay, bye. Grabs his easel, grabs Jeff, runs out of the room. And I don't remember whether they come back that day or they come back the next day or 2 days later. And they say, so we got it. And he launches into this whole complex idea for 52. And to Dan's credit, it's really the first time anybody tries to use the sort of TV writer's room approach
Mm-hmm.
for doing a comic. It's going to be an enormous amount of work. Jeff's already pretty committed and pretty busy. So I hear it. I like it. I sign off on it. I say, you know, you're digging a pretty deep hole of work here. You know, if there's anything I can do to be helpful, let me know. You know, if you need a hand on JSA, I love those characters, happy to help. So I ended up jumping in and writing a half dozen issues of that series to give Jeff some of the time to work on 52.
So it was, in the end, it was because of 52.
Yeah.
That's a fun one. I didn't know that part. Philippe Brel asked, The Great Darkness is one of my favorite Legion runs. Who suggested using Darkseid in the 30th century?
I don't remember. It could have been me. It could have been Keith. I would think it's more likely to be me than Keith, simply because I had already started to use Darkseid in the Legion in a Pat Broderick story before Keith was the lead artist. So I think I was the one who came up with it. But my memory is not that good that I know for sure.
Mm-hmm. Felipe asked, how do you remember your run as Patient Town publisher for so many years? That's the second question, which is the important one. Did you miss writing during this period? Or did you feel happy being in that position, or that made you able to help other people publishing their stories?
Well, I didn't stop writing because of the day job. I stopped writing because my children were 2 and 4, my older two. My youngest hadn't been born yet. And the way American comics worked in those days, your writing was your second job, was your moonlighting job. And I was already making a decent living, so I didn't need a second job. I loved doing the writing. It was fun. But I really loved my kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted the weekends to be on the soccer field with them and to be taking my daughter to dance class and just, running around with them. And so I stopped for 20 years, except for, a handful of stories like the JSA here and there when either some special opportunity came up or an editor said, please, can you do something? When I came back to writing, I was rusty, and the medium had moved on a bit.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1980s, I think with fair modesty say that if I wasn't the flavor of the day, I was in the solid first rank of commercial writers in the field. Mm-hmm. Legion was usually DC's second best-selling regular title through most of that decade.
It was New Teen Titans and yourselves, right?
Yeah.
People used to forget that during a good amount of time, you and Titans were the top, and the other one weren't even close. Let's be honest.
We were the rent payers. Everybody was looking at what Alan was doing on Swamp Thing as being brilliant creative work, but it wasn't selling as well. The superhero stuff just had a better market at that moment. None of the DC books were doing as well as Chris's work on X-Men, certainly, but we were solid, important titles in the form at the time. When I came back, the culture had moved on a bit. I hadn't stayed immersed in it. I'm certainly not immersed in it now. I have a lot of craft and skill as a comic book writer, as a writer, period, I guess. But I'm not going to be in danger of being the flavor of the day these days.
Mm-hmm.
Mercifully, I don't have to make a living doing it now. So I do things that I enjoy and hopefully a reasonable number of readers enjoy. But I do miss being the flavor of the day. That was a lot of fun.
Tuno Nocturno says, I have another question. This is a very good question, in fact. As readers, how can we really appreciate the job of an editor?
Well, it's harder these days because editors have less creative control over most books and stay in place on books less long. If you look back on the comics I grew up on, it was easy to appreciate Julie Schwartz as an editor because he did Flash and Green Lantern for 10 years or so, and he really set a specific style, and you could see it extend from one book to another. And also the writers and artists he worked with followed him from book to book and didn't work for other editors. That wasn't a very healthy business arrangement for the writers and artists, but it enabled you to appreciate the editor more. I think as readers, you look and see if there's a coincidental pattern that you like the books a particular editor does. If you say, these are my 10 favorite comics, and 5 of them have the same editor's name in the credits, then you have some respect for the editor's taste. You don't necessarily know their technique. You don't know how they do it.
Yeah.
But you know what they do. The editor's job is mysterious. My favorite conversation I ever had with Stan one night at a hamburger hamlet. I don't remember the year. I don't remember the exact circumstance, but he turns around and says, the guys at Marvel want me to do some more editing these days. what does an editor do these days, Paul? And I laughed and I said, well, Stan, to all intents and purposes, I haven't been an editor almost as long as you haven't been an editor. He stopped in 78,
78?
77 or 78, maybe, depending on how you measure it. I stopped in 81. We're both he was a lot older than I was, but we were both ancient as editors go. But I said, but I think being an editor is still the same. It's the same goal. It's getting the best work out of the people. And everybody had different techniques. We started talking about Archie. And I said, look, I could never understand how Archie did it. Every other editor that I ever watched and ever worked, I could learn something from. Archie, I couldn't figure out Archie's fingerprints. I mean, he was the nicest guy in the world, and somehow he got the best work out of people. I don't know how. And we laughed a little bit, and Stan sighed and said, but I wasn't much of an editor. I just wrote all of it myself. I laughed at him again. I said, Stan, I worked with all the guys you worked with. Don Heck, Dick Ayers, never mind Jack and Steve, the great geniuses. Don and Dick, thorough professionals, hardworking, good guys, always did the best they could on any given day, and nobody ever got as good work out of them as you did. I certainly didn't. And he smiled, and he thought back for a second, and he said, Dick, I remember Dick. Every time I would send him a script, he'd call me on the phone, and he'd say, okay, Chief, what do you want me to do with this one? And you can see the avatar replacing the human. Well, Dick, it was a Western. I don't remember what the Western was, but it was a Western. So I want to see the hoofs flashing and I want to see the spurs shining, and he's going full Stan Lee.
Yeah.
I'm cracking up and laughing at him. And I just said, that's how you did it, Stan.
Yeah.
When he came in to drop off a job with me, he'd get out his little notebook and he'd say, hatch off how many days it would be at 3 pages a day of doing layouts. Okay, Paul, so I'll be back on June 19th for my next one. Will you have something ready for me? And I'd say, sure, Dick, that'd be fine. I'll have the next one set for then. And he'd give me some candy that his wife had sent home from her job at the Lifesavers factory. And we'd smile at each other, and he'd go off and he'd draw the pages. And you got him excited.
Mm-hmm. That was going to be my next question. We literally just lost Danny, and Marty was also recent, and we also and Archie a long time ago. But what made them so special? Why is everybody coming back? Everybody, every time I talk to Chi, for example, or the others, or in Marvel it would be Grunwald, Mark Grunwald.
Sure.
There's always 3-4 names that everybody goes back to. Those were special. These guys were special. They're in everybody's memories, not only as human beings, but as teachers, as editors. I met Danny like a couple times briefly, and when I talked to him, he struck me as a guy not of many words, but all of them were really precise, if you know what I mean.
Uh-huh.
I never met Archie. That's one of my. Every time Chi talks about Archie, it's like this is one of the guys I never met, and I'm sure I could have loved. Yeah. And Chi's always he could have loved you too because you could mess. Like I don't know, but this is one of my sadnesses that I never got to meet Archie because everybody, including yourself, says the same. He was special. Why?
Well, I think one thing is you're talking all about people who came into comics before you could make any money. One of the things that bonded most of my generation, and by my generation, I don't just mean people who are exactly my age, but basically the guys who came in after the golden age.
Yeah.
We weren't Depression kids. We came into comics at a time when the American economy was pretty good. We could have gotten other jobs. A lot of people were smart people. You didn't come into comics because you could get rich, because you certainly couldn't. You didn't come into comics because you could get famous, because you couldn't. You didn't come into comics because you could get laid. There weren't a lot of women around. There were much better places to go hunting. And certainly, to the extent that comics ever acquired anybody who was hanging around for social purposes, it was years after that. You came in because comics were interesting. They were fun. You wanted to be part of it. And not everybody was great at it. Not everybody certainly was a great teacher. But most of the people were very passionate about what they were doing. They were going to do their best.
Yeah.
For some people, their best was pretty mediocre.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't hang around that long. But the people who did great work, at the very least, they got a lot of applause. They got a lot of people telling them they were doing great work. And some of them stuck for a long time. And that was wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them, Denny was a fabulous teacher. Archie was a fabulous editor. And people liked them. You know, they were good people.
Mm-hmm.
I think to this day, comics has a disproportionately large percentage of good people in the community.
Yeah.
We have so many young people who are working at comics that can't even make them a living, but just because they love the form and they want to express themselves. A lot of great, nice people working to make this a good community to be in. Not perfect, and you shudder every now and then when the latest story hits the web of somebody who has behavioral problems.
Yeah.
And we have some. But in most cases, the community is pretty quick once that happens to say, go over there.
Yeah.
We don't have a door we can lock, but we're just going to tell everybody else that they shouldn't get near you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, I completely agree. I think one of the things that kept me in comics, because what got me into it was my love for them, as a kid, since we met as a kid, was the community. Was getting there 98, 99, my first San Diego, and meeting the people. And I want to stay here. I want to keep being a part of it, because the reception for that Spanish guy that was starting to be an agent where there was no agents and blah, 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 and my conventions and everything was like, not like a foreigner or not like an ant who want to come here to be stumped. It was the opposite. It was like, come over, come be a part of us, which was for me like, I don't think that happens in any other field. Let me be completely honest. To be as open and friendly to people, and we want you to be a part of the fun. I think that's only in comics.
I think there are probably other fields that have some version of it, but we've been very lucky in the version we've had. And isn't it wonderful? When I was doing fanzines as a kid, people from two countries wrote me saying, can we reprint your material in our fanzine? One was a fanzine called Comic Media in England, and the two kids who were publishing it were a guy named Richard Burton, no relationship to the actor, and a guy named Nick Landau. You know well now, who went on to build Titan Comics, Titan Books, Forbidden Planet, half the world.
half the British industry.
In Scandinavia, there was a kid named Karsten Sondergaard, and he turns up again decades later editing Superman for Scandinavia, the reprints there. I had a kid in France who was sending me information about the French band dessinée. I didn't publish much about that, but every now and then he would tell me something that was going on. And it was J.P. Dionne who ends up being one of the founders of heavy metal.
Yeah.
A German kid who was interested in comics, who was starting to be a scholar about it, who would write one of the great books about it, named Wolfgang Fuchs, who we lost also in this last year. I got to have friends across the world. I'm a kid in Brooklyn. I'm a working class kid. I have no connections. I have no magic superpowers. I'm making a little fanzine first in my room in my parents' house, and then ultimately in the basement when we toss out the tenants so I can have a little more working space. It's a 16-foot wide house attached on both sides. There were no professional anything living on my block.
Mm-hmm.
It was bus driver, exterminator, clerk, this, that. And comics let me defy that world and connect with this wider world and make people who would be my friends for life, and open these doors so that I can be sitting here having a conversation with you in Spain, and having people in Spain sending in texts or whatever technology they're doing, having read my stories and asking questions about them and caring. I think you have to have a pretty hard heart if you don't get a kick out of that.
Absolutely. Like, you gotta be a real sociopath if you don't get a kick out of that. I'm sorry, but let's be honest. If you don't get emotional, you're like, yeah, you got a problem. Sorry, you got a problem.
Maybe there's some other field where you can do that too that I never touched or blundered on. Maybe scientists, where, if you're the guys studying viruses, please, doing a great job these days. One hopes everybody else who cares about viruses, and you're getting on Zoom, even not in a pandemic, and talking, hey, I found this latest cool thing about viruses. Let's all talk about it. Mm. But I don't think they're having as much fun as we are.
No, and also science is, and I've experienced it, with family members and all that. Science, main reason to exist is to deny the other. Meaning, the scientific method is peer comparison, saying no and checking and checking and checking. They don't check. The old phrase, an editor has 100 reasons to say no to your work and just want to say yes. Yeah. It also applies to scientists. Their work is to find every possible hole. So that vaccine we were talking about doesn't maim, kill people, doesn't work after the first time you get a shot, blah, blah, blah. So even if they don't want to, scientists have to be fierce competitors, because the way they have to deny the other. The good thing is that, as you said, they understand each other because they know the other has to do that. It's part of their obligation.
Well, and that's part of the fun of comics too, when you think about it, that for the most part, we don't compete with each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
At the end of the day, once in a while, a DC and Marvel can be bidding for the same artist or writer in the course of it. But as often as not, they're going to be making their choice about what assignment they're going to do based on business policies of the company are better or worse. They're doing it because they love the character or they love the work of the creator. All the marketing in the world can do is just provide a good invitation to tell people what's going on, or throw a little accelerant on a fire if it started to happen by itself. So it's very different than the movie business, where there can only be one movie that'll be the best-selling movie this weekend, and there's so many screens you can put it on. So we've been very lucky.
Yeah, absolutely. Felipe asks, do you have any new story related with the Legion, or you think that you told everything you wanted to tell with those characters? I enjoyed your run. Your villain stories, characters, and stories are amazing. You made it look so easy.
I'm sure I would have found 100 more stories if I'd stayed for 100 more issues, but I'm not sitting here with any of them bottled up.
That's a good one. So, curiosity here. Of course, for a long time, in comparison to Europe, as you said, in Europe we have the album format or any other format. In America, it's the monthly, the monthly stapled. I don't like to call them pamphlets or anything like that. The monthly staple comics. Did you ever think about changing the format in the sense of paperbacks are working so well, let's move to do directly paperbacks or something like that, or you just thought the pragmatic way, as I would, to be honest. The monthlies still are better sellers. When the collections sell better, we'll maybe think about it.
We constantly look for new formats. We did original graphic novels early on. One of my first failures, I'll reach up on the shelf. Pardon me going out of range for a second.
Don't worry about it.
Where are you? So one of my first failures as a business guy was looking at your world. One of the things that bothered me about comics when I came in is that for most other forms of entertainment in those years, if you went in a record store, you could get this month's hot group, whoever that was, but you could still get the Beatles.
Yep.
You went in a bookstore, you could get John Grisham, or you can get Agatha Christie.
Yep.
When I came into comics, you could only get this month's Fish Wrap.
That's true.
And I spent about a decade trying to find an answer. So one of my first failures was looking at the European album format, really nice format, and working out a deal with Roger Slifer, and I think Dave Kraft was a silent partner in the deal, to take Archie and Walt's Manhunter, which was a brilliant piece of work and sort of fit the format well, and put it out in album format for the comic shops. And I forget how few copies they sold, but it was pathetic.
I need to find that book. I don't have that one. I need to find it.
And it's black and white, so you get Walt's art gloriously.
Okay, I'm gonna find it. It's who published it?
They called themselves Excalibur Press at the time.
I will find it.
Good luck.
Anyway, you were going.
So I tried again and again. We tried with comic format reprints on the Baxter paper a few years after that, when that came in, and then eventually we tried with the trade paperback. I think at one point Jeanette and I tallied up, and we had experimented with something like 13 different formats in the time that one of the two of us was in charge of the company. Some of them stuck, trade paperback most notably. Not that nobody had ever done one before, but it really was what we did with it that defined it. When you look back at the timeline and you look at the physical specs. I like the monthly comic. I think it's a fabulous storytelling format. I think the serial kind of stories, kinds of things I love to do on the Legion, work well in it. I don't think it's the only format for comics. I don't think it should be the only format.
Absolutely.
But I hope it's around for a long time.
Mm-hmm. El Turno Nocturno asks, how was the evolution from the necktie, between brackets, DC, to the post-crisis DC? How was the change for veterans like Julie Schwartz, who were there from Weisinger to the end of Crisis?
Well, I mean, a lot of the guys from the Silver Age team were retiring by that time. I mean, by the time Crisis takes place, Julie was 60. Julie was about 70 years old at the time of Crisis. Murray Boltinoff had already retired and was just freelance editing a couple of things. So you really had a younger generation running it. Not kids. Dick and Joe were grown men. They'd had long careers behind them, but that first generation of comics had pretty much faded out already by that time.
Mhm. Are you a multiverse guy or a post-crisis guy?
No, I mean, I'm a child of the Silver Age. You know, if you charted my knowledge of the material in DC Comics, it would probably peak up between the beginning of the Silver Age, probably reach its peak in the mid 70s or the late 70s, decline through the 80s, and by the comics that are my joy are the comics that I love to read. The later permutations are fine, but they're somebody else's comics.
No, I was asking because, of course, you were part of the of Crisis on Infinite Earths.
Yeah,
and I always thought that for you, and also I thought for Mark, in a way, and others, those were the comics you grew up loving, the multiverse and all that, and you were being told, or you were deciding, we need to get rid of that. So it has to, in a way, it had to break your heart as fans also.
We had a fan working for us at that time as librarian, lovely man named Mark Hannerfield, who was one of the real first generation of fans with Len and Marv here in New York. He was briefly an assistant editor at both DC and Marvel at different times. And during Crisis, he'd been our librarian for a while, and he came in one day and he said, "Look, my doctor says I have to quit because what you're doing to Supergirl, I just can't take it. It's hurting me that much."
Mm-hmm.
I understand. You get very close to these things. I was schizophrenic enough because there was the business guy in me as well as the reader and the writer, and they could all argue with each other.
Okay. Felipe asks, when did you decide to be the chronicle of DC Comics history? To write a Will Eisner biography was one of your goals after you retired from DC?
So when I was getting up from the desk, we had done the deal with Taschen, I guess about 2 years previously, to do a 75 years book. And they'd been working assiduously through all that time, putting together all the visuals, doing all the research. But the editors still hadn't found anybody to write it. So they turned around to me and said, "Hey, you're not going to have anything better to do. And we're really on deadline, and you can probably write this faster than anybody else because you know so much of it." And it was great. It was a fun book to do. It reminded people I was a writer at a moment when that was perfect to remind people. Taschen did a fabulous job producing it. It's a gorgeous book. They're still producing different editions of it. I'm still getting royalty checks on it. Just got one this week. Small checks these days, but still, buy a few dinners. And it got awards all over the place, not just in the US, but in England and Germany. So it was perfect for me. The Eisner book, I always loved Eisner's work. I loved Will, was friendly with him for a long time, but I had no plan to write a book. Charlie Kochman at Abrams wanted a book on Eisner, knew I knew Will well, knew I knew the history, and said, "You want to do that next?"
Mm-hmm.
One of my problems as a writer is I'm much more an assignment guy than a guy who's sitting here with, these are the 5 next things I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
I have one book project that I'm screwing around with slowly that I've been talking about for about a decade, and maybe I'll finally get around to doing now.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't have a long bucket list of what my next project should be.
Mm-hmm.
Waiting for people to call and ask.
Luis Guaraña says 70 Years of DC Comics is an amazing, important, and wonderful book. With that historical perspective, how Paul sees the future of American comics and a reinvention that some people think that it's needed.
So again, I'm an odd duck because I'm a business guy as well as a creative guy. When I look at the world, Japanese manga is somewhere between 1/3 and 40% of the Japanese publishing industry. The bande dessinée in France, Belgium, is about 15% of the publishing industry there. I don't know the stats for Spain, but I think it's less than France, but it's still maybe 10% or north. In America, we've only been at about 4 or 5% of the publishing industry. Okay, maybe the thing that is the most important factor in that is if you walk into a Japanese bookstore, you can get a manga about anything.
Yes.
You can get how to cook. You can get the life of Theodore Roosevelt. You can get something about any sexual practice you can imagine. Some I hope you can't imagine. To some extent, that's true to a lesser degree about the European album world. In America, up until a decade ago, we only had 2 or 3 flavors. I think the future of comics in America, and we're seeing it, is as we're offering more and more different kinds of material, you're seeing the form grow. And whether it's periodical comics, graphic novels, web comics, I think it's a question of finding the different stories to tell.
Absolutely. I keep hearing about the distribution, and I keep arguing back saying it's the material. If you get the readers what they want, they're going to find it. I keep talking about Tilly Walden. In Spain, the market is growing a lot in the last 5-6 years, because it's the same thing. We have a limited variety of kinds of comics, as it happens in France. Sales are going down because of they keep going with the same kind of books, right, and they're not evolving. But the Spanish market has changed a lot, with a lot of new creators who are exploring, as you said, like in the Japanese market, each different flavor. They're telling their own stories. So that's helping the market a lot. And when people ask me, why is the market in Spain growing so much? I keep repeating, the distribution hasn't changed. It's not that. It's that we're giving the readers things that they wanted, but they couldn't get because they weren't being produced.
Well, but distribution has changed because you have online distribution.
Oh, that's true. That's also true.
We were frozen for a long time because I remember in the 80s, we did a lot of work at one point. I'm sorry, not the 80s, it was the 90s, with a couple of major ad agencies to try and figure out advertising campaigns to get people to buy more comics. And they do all this research and they analyze the market and they say, look, we can do all the ads you want. You're not going to make more money, because we have to first tell people that comics aren't what they think they are.
Mm-hmm.
They know what in 1990 thought they knew what a comic book was, and they either liked them or they didn't like them. And then we're going to have to tell them, and by the way, in order to buy these damn things, you're going to have to go out of your way, because first you're going to have to figure out where they're being sold, and then you're going to have to go out of your shopping pattern to do it. And it's not a very important thing in anybody's life to do that for. So we can spend a lot of money introducing the idea that you might like this thing, but it's going to cost more money to bring the people in than you can possibly make selling the comics. Well, in the world we're in now, where everybody can communicate with each other, so when you do a new thing, we don't even have to do the advertising, but people start talking about it online, people start creating buzz about it, social media enables you to communicate out, and, oh, I think that would be interesting, let me order a copy. And whether it's from Amazon or whether it's from a comics retailer, that becomes a gateway drug. And if they decide they like it enough, then they'll figure out where a comic shop is. So, I really like that stuff. Let me go look at this. There must be someplace where they've got a real selection of it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And where do you go? Where do you think we're going from now in the United States market? As you said, that was Spain. Do you think that the same situation we're having in Spain, as again, getting more and more creators, creating more diverse stuff,
If you,
and of course more women creators and more different kind of comics, and even in formats. Because one guy was asking, I'm sorry, let me see the name. He's pointing at where is it? I'm sorry about that. Yes, Luis Guaragna was saying, seems that DC is starting to make some strategic movements in that direction with the young adult books and and the changes in distribution. That is a separate thing. But with the young adult books, like looking for a different audience.
I don't see any reason why comics in America shouldn't sell as well as comics in France or Spain. We're a less literate country in general, so we have that as a disadvantage. People in America don't like to read for pleasure in the same quantity. So maybe we've got some disadvantage. And Japan, I think, has the unique advantage that the very language itself is an ideograph.
Mm-hmm.
They start off visual, but we're in an era of visual communication. The kids are talking to each other in emojis and GIFs and memes. If we can come up with the material, why shouldn't we be at 10, 12, 15% of the publishing business?
Mm-hmm. Let's hope. As I said, I hope, with the new generation of creators, as you said, different formats, internet, webcomics, the influences make them want to do different kind of stories too, and that takes us to new readers. I think that's going to happen.
And their lives are different. They grew up on different stories. They grew up interested in different things, and they're exposed to different material.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see.
Yeah. I always wanted to ask you that and you guys created and I always forgot, of course, when you guys created Vertigo, was that influenced in any way by what Archie and the others have done on Epic Comics, or not at all?
Not particularly. I mean, Epic the magazine was fascinating. Epic Comics really sputtered and didn't work very well. Certainly, we were interested in what was going on in the field, looking at the wide range of independent work that was being done. I think we were more jealous of American Flag than we were of anything at Epic. But Vertigo itself was really that Karen already was doing it. We just hadn't labeled it. And it was a natural next step.
Mm-hmm. So let me see how much time, because you have a life.
I have a life. I have another Zoom in a little bit.
Yes. We've been at 87 minutes with this. Oh, look, Jose Luis Garcia Lopez just connected.
And
says, hello, Paul. Always a pleasure to see you.
Hello, Jose. A dear friend, a brilliant artist, and it's one of the joys of my life to have been able to collaborate with him a handful of times.
We consider him family here, so you're preaching to the choir with Jose Luis, my friend. This is for you. So, Paul is again 90 minutes, an hour and a half, and I know you have another thing coming, and you need to rest. Before I want to thank you so much for being here. It's been amazing. I hope you enjoyed it enough that we repeat it sometime in the future.
Absolutely. There's always more to talk about, David.
Absolutely, and always good things, because we are optimistic and positive people. Whatever you guys can think, we are optimistic and positive.
Stay safe, stay well, and read a comic book today.
Absolutely. Please don't cut, because I want to say proper goodbye to you after we cut the feed. And to all of you, have a great weekend. Read a comic book, as Paul said. Have fun. Don't go out too much. Remember, we are still in a pandemic. I don't want to be a party popper. But that's a reality, so be careful out there, as Hill Street Blues used to say. See you all on Monday with Mr. Greg Rucka. Have fun. Bye. Cutting in 3, 2, 1.